Can we reconvene, please, chiefs and delegates? Letting you know we're moving out of camera and the webcast is going to be re-engaged. On that's it. Okay. Inviting forward Chief Chapman and Cameron Lewis from Flinroe. Did Cameron? Yes. Okay. First of all, Cameron, appreciating your sticking with us. We certainly didn't mean any disrespect or anything by bumping you from yesterday. It was just we had lots of business to take us through. So turning it over to microphone 23. We got about 30 minutes on this topic. CM.
Thank you. Good morning. And thanks again to Kamloops for hosting the work here. But I was just talking to Grand Chief Stewart, and it's been more than a meeting. It's been a celebration, and I'm just very happy to be able to have been part of this celebration. I'd like to acknowledge my co-presenter, Cameron. We've just met. We've met over email, but we've been communicating back and forth. I'd also like to acknowledge Premier Horgan for asking me to participate in this daunting work. I was not at all familiar with what we were going to embark upon, but learned very quickly. Appreciate that appointment. Just want to say that the reference documents, it says in the second part of the handout that's in your kit, there's a website if you'd like to review the report. We purposely didn't print a lot of reports. Grand Chief Stewart has a paper copy, but if you're looking to review that, there is a website that's referenced. This work was very challenging in that we had a very tight time frame. It was during the winter months, but it was also the differing points of view from someone from my background that's lived and breathed First Nations, and someone that's lived and breathed government. But there was an aha moment for me about 3/4 of the way through when we started going through our recommendations, and saw the wisdom of Premier Horgan's selection. So what I'm going to do is you don't have this report, but I'm going to just cover off what I thought was key in that the letter to the Premier included the UN Declaration, and that was really important for that to be included, and that this work was going to be true nation to nation in terms of a relationship. The focus was on the 2017 flood and wildfire sessions. And the first recommendation I thought was the most important one, in that First Nations people in BC were included from the very beginning of all work, not just this initiative, but be included at the tables and be part of the decision making right from the beginning to the end. And that was recommendation number 1. So what I'd like to talk about is what we call in the report the strategic shifts, and I've been directed by my fellow chiefs not to read to you, so I'll make every attempt not to do that. But strategic shift, one was to develop strategic partnerships and operational agreements with key members in our communities, those that have the forest tenures, those that live amongst the forest, and those that rely on their location for their businesses, because we saw a lot of people not just damaged by the fires, but by the flooding that took out their livelihoods. And that was important to people to say, please acknowledge, we all live together, whether you're First Nations or not. And I went into this project not being just the First Nations representative, I said, I'm going to talk to everyone that wants to talk to me, whether you're First Nations or not, and be clear that there was some blatant racism, because there was people that absolutely would not talk to me. They'd wait and talk to George. But I wasn't surprised. The strategic shift 2 is to establish emergency centers of excellence in the interior locations, because that was the hardest hit after we started this report. Since then, this last fire season, of course, has been the north that has really been impacted by the fires. Strategic shift 3 was for BC to review and clarify roles and responsibilities around the flood management, because I think that was equally as important to people that were affected by the flooding throughout the areas that we visited. Strategic shift 4 is regarding building a central hub or one-stop shop emergency communication website, or some other communication where people could actually get information. There was a lot of silence out there in terms of where do I go, what do I do, how do I start? And not being in the front lines of this, it's hard to understand when people are displaced. So some communication that's not going to fail when that is what people are relying on for their lives and their safety. Strategic shift 5 is to undertake a portfolio approach to prevention where at all possible. A recommendation to government to look at this and see if we can sort it so that there's specialty people to address things in a really timely manner. Strategic shift 6 is to encourage the establishment of area-based tenures adjacent to Indigenous reserves, First Nations reserves, so that this relationship is developed and nurtured before and during emergencies. Strategic shift 7 is fire be established as a management objective in the Forest and Range Practices Act and other applicable legislation and regulations to encourage fire as part of the land management, which we've done historically. 8, expand Fire Smart community objectives to become broad-based objectives for our communities. And those that are not familiar with Fire Smart, I recommend that you become familiar with Fire Smart. It's a really advantageous tool. 9, we talked about BC increasing the use of traditional and prescribed burning as a tool. And many people were unaware that this is a practice that has been historical. And this helps to reduce the risk associated with landscape and local level hazards and to regenerate the ecosystems. I'm trying to keep track if I'm going in the right order. Number 10, to increase the resiliency of BC's ecosystems and communities against climate change, because as we all know, the denial is out there across the world that there is any climate change happening, and so we really need to stay abreast of what's going on with the climate change and acknowledge that it's real. Number 11 is that BC improve interagency operations by developing a single integrated system for identification and access permits when there's roadblocks. A lot of challenges were reported with the RCMP that were flown in from areas that they're not familiar with where they were brought to. They were very rigid in some cases. A lot of work needs to happen with the RCMP or anyone that's manning those roadblocks that really caused a lot of problems and heartaches for people, and actually some of the situations became dangerous because people didn't understand that they needed to get through to bring that formula to that baby that was in that community. And there were so many stories, heartbreaking stories, and people going and putting themselves in danger because they had to take care of things like that. 11, well, that was 11. I've only got 14. So The number 12 is to support a BC First model for employment during emergencies. A lot of concern was out there because we brought people from other countries that weren't familiar with the territories, weren't familiar with the way fires behaved on our lands. And what I heard from our community members, that we've lived here all of our lives, we know the land, we know how to stop a fire. Please allow us to do this. And unfortunately, that didn't happen a lot. And these are just touching on the shifts that we're recommending. There were 108 recommendations altogether, which probably took us about 2 months to actually work through, pare down, argue, debate, and the report is fully on the website. Shift number 13 at BC co-developed timber salvage harvest plans with all forest tenure holders, including the joint planning and allocation of available timber for harvest. That's something that people talked a lot about, is all the fuel that is left out on the woodlots, and nothing's been cleared up, and people aren't allowed to go in and get the wood to use for themselves or do controlled burning to get rid of the fuel that's there. And lastly, 14 is consistent with the Sendai principle of Build Back Better. The disaster financial assistance and disaster financial assistance arrangements programs provide greater flexibility to restore damaged sites. And so there was a lot of challenges to people getting the funds that they needed to not only rebuild, but just get back to their communities so that they could start repairing what happened. We had a number of elders that were coming back from the Elders Gathering in Campbell River. Stalo hosted, I think, at least 28 elders in hotels and took care, brought them to the communities as often as possible, because the hotel food got old fast, and the elders were just heartbroken that they couldn't go home. That is my portion, Mr. Chairman, and I will be available the rest of the day. I know we're crunched for time. I will take questions, and now turn this over to Cameron. Thank you.
Mike 22.
Yep. Thank you, Chief Chapman. My name is Cameron Lewis. I'm the executive lead with the provincial government for the follow-up on the Chapman-Abbott report. I report both to Emergency Management BC and to Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. Just before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge my presence here in the Tecumloops community. It's an honor to be here and have a chance to present to you today. I'd also like to recognize that although much of what we're talking about here focuses on the improvements moving forward, I think I don't have to tell this group that there's people right now that are involved in the very difficult work of recovery. So even though we're looking forward, there's people that are still very impacted by these events right now. Also, something that I think colors all of this is that the First Nations communities in BC really are vastly disproportionately impacted by these events, and that's really something that has to kind of color everything that we do to address this. Let's see, make sure they got the clicker going here. So presenters were asked to put their key messages right up front. So I would say the key messages here today is that how much the province values the recommendations that are in the report, and that we're following up on them. And the other key message really is that we want to work through those recommendations with First Nations leadership and communities, and we're really seeking input on how best to do that. So I won't spend too much time on this, but maybe I'll just kind of go quickly through a little bit of some of the high points on the events of the last couple of years. So 2017 flooding, there was landslides and debris flows in some communities, flooding around Okanagan Lake especially. There were several First Nations communities impacted, and the damage from that event was about $72 million. In 2018, it was a different event. Flooding started about a month earlier than it did in 2017, and rather than being focused around Okanagan Lake, this was really, a whole bunch of river courses around the province. And of course, we had the catastrophic flooding in Grand Forks, which I think people are aware of, and that recovery is ongoing right now as well. And we also had some landslides in the Cache Creek corridor, which were a direct result of the fires in the previous year. They have some animation on these slides, so I'm just trying to advance. There we go. Just some stats for the 2017 and 2018 years. I'll just go through a few of these. Hectares burned. I think people know that 2017 was a record year at 1.2 million hectares, and then 2018 was a record again at 1.3 plus. Fire suppression costs, over $500 million last year, and close to 400 million this year. That figure's a few weeks old, so it might be greater than that now. People affected by evacuation order, fewer in 2018 than 2017, but again, this was disproportionately impacting First Nations communities. So, even though the number is smaller for those communities that were impacted, the impacts are really severe. And same for structures. Fewer structures this year, but disproportionately First Nations communities. So I don't think I have to tell this group, the communities from the, don't have to tell you this group the impacts. The mental impacts, the physical impacts, the environment, housing, economic, all the way through to cultural impacts. And those impacts don't end when the fires end. As everyone here knows, it's a really complex interaction of all the different impacts on the individuals and the communities. So the events of 2017, the unprecedented events, led to a lot of after action reviews, both internal to agencies and publicly, and that culminated in the work that was done by Chief Chapman and George Abbott. And the recommendations coming out of those activities have been quite influential. There was a lot of practice changes that were done in 2018 that tried to improve on 2017. So by no means are we there yet, and absolutely a ton of challenges still in 2018. But I just want to touch on some of the efforts that were made to improve practice in 2018, particularly around some of the First Nations emergency management pieces. So in terms of the First Nations emergency management, significant efforts around enhanced operational support, dedicated First Nations liaisons in a number of the ops centers, the wildfire coordination calls with First Nations, production of a First Nations toolkit to help navigate some of the emergency management structures and programs. There was the initiation of the First Nations Emergency Management Partnership tables and some enhanced training and public education pieces. Some work that's underway now includes exploring regional partnerships between local authorities and adjacent First Nations communities, and also the work that's going on a tripartite MOU with federal government, BC, and Leadership Council with Finesse. And then, a number of other practice changes more broadly in terms of integrating across government, reaching out more to stakeholders, use of some different knowledge and tools and technologies to improve on the response, some added staffing and facilities, and a greater communication and public education. But again, I would just reiterate, it's not to say that we're there yet, just to kind of communicate that there was a lot of effort in trying to capitalize on the lessons of 2017 going forward to 2018. So, having touched on some of those efforts, there's still a lot to be done. And the Chapman-Abbott report really is a key touchstone for government to guide those improvements. But a lot of the recommendations, they're big. A lot of the recommendations in there would require legislation, would require, development of some real solutions with with partners, including title holders, technology change, those kinds of things. So, you know, those kinds of things are not going to happen overnight as much as we aggressively push improvements before the next, before the next season. The province also has the report that went to the House of Commons, the From the Ashes report regarding emergency management and fire safety on reserves. And there's also, you know, a theme that was strong in the Chapman-Abbott report was around climate change. There was also an Auditor General's report around climate change risk. So we need to kind of, you know, pull the impacts of those recommendations as well as the lessons that are emerging out of 2018. And we need to, you know, figure out what the right way is to move forward with those, you know, collectively. With the Chapman-Abbott report being kind of the core of that improvement process. So, you know, I think a big question is how are we going to do that? And particularly how are we going to do that with First Nations leadership and communities? I would say, you know, the provincial government cannot and should not try to, you know, prioritize, assess, and work through these recommendations alone. You know, that needs to happen with, you know, First Nations communities and leadership input and involvement and partnership from the start. I think that was a point that Chief Chapman made as well. But how are we actually going to do that? You know, we have, you know, good lines of communication with Finesse. An invitation has gone to the Leadership Council to, you know, ask how this engagement should happen. There's an opportunity coming up at Leadership Gathering where, you know, an invitation will be going out to make EMBC and Flynn Road senior staff available to discuss these issues if that's desired. We also have the First Nations Emergency Management Partnership tables around the province that are you run with the help of the EMBC, so that could be a potential venue for discussion. And we also have the technical working group, the group that's working on the tripartite MOU between Indigenous Services Canada and the province and First Nations with Leadership Council with the help of Finesse. So that, you know, that's a potential body that we could use to further this discussion as well. So I think ultimately, you know, we're working towards that endpoint here that's often described as a true partnership, you know, and I don't think we're not there yet, but I guess the main question that I kind of bring today is, you know, we want to work together on this, but what is the right mechanism for that, the right sort of the right venue for that. So maybe I'll you know, I seek direction on that, and I would welcome input on that. And my contact information is there at the end. So thank you.
Thank you. Opening up a discussion, starting at mic 8.
Well, first of all, thank you, Maureen, for coming to my community and having a really great discussion with my council around the impacts of the 2017 fire flap in Williams Lake area and surrounding area, basically. One of the things that I'm kind of curious, and I kind of look to you, Cameron, because you are part of the Flynn Road group, is rural development of fire preparation and flood preparations, and the final approvals for those. They need to be streamlined, because we know with the research from 2017, 2018 that is now coming about, I think streamlining those processes and prepping for those areas is key. You also talked about the, well, there was also discussion around the fire preparedness plan for First Nations communities, and the fire preparedness plan, for me, being from Esquette, we're a rural community, we aren't urban, but we do have homes in an area that require residential fire suppression, so that we need that set up for our community. Last year, or 2017, the community bought just over $340,000 of firefighting equipment to protect our reserves. And just so that leadership here understands, the Skedum is piecemealed. We had one major rancher in our territory, And that major rancher back in the mid-1800s took all of our reserve lands and piecemealed it. And all of our reserve lands are on our maps that have been hand-drawn by Indian agents right across the map. It's a IR5, poor worthless land, rocky terrain, you know, and these are our reserve lands, but we have homes on these lands. And we need to protect those structures. There's nothing been put forward for residential protection for these rural communities. And I'm really looking at you, Cameron, because I've been talking with Susan O'Sullivan and Devin Ramsey about this, about trying to recoup those dollars that came out of basically our budgets to protect the structures. So I think that's something that needs to be further discussed at a First Nations level. And there was also discussion around the fire preparedness of the forests around these areas. Well, we have a community forest, and I'm proud to say our community forest has been very successful. We've jumped through all the hoops of the province and then the federal government to get our community forest. So it's registered, it's not a direct award. So we maintain and look after our own community forest. So what we did was we put forward a proposal and we sent it off, and we went ahead and did it anyway to protect our main reserve. We harvested all the wood and took out the understory up to 80%, so that if a fire does come ripping over the mountain, and where we live, it's a valley and it's got fir trees on both sides, so at least now we can slow it down and we'll have an opportunity to protect our reserves. There was talk about Eskedem being fined for doing that without approval. And I'm kind of curious as to where that's going to go, because Eskedem's been pretty fortunate, our community forest. We believe in ceremony in our community, and every year we go out and we put out staffs to protect our community forest and the surrounding area. And it's really interesting to see that the fires they seem to come right up to the staffs and stop. So the power of ceremony is real. And we've been doing that for the past 5 or 6 years. And we've been really fortunate to be able to control our territory in that way. But the way things have unfolded this year, and this is something that Maureen, you didn't bring up, but I'm kind of curious, because First Nations are impacted no matter where the fire is. If it's near our community or away from our community, if that's an area where we used to go hunt and gather, then that impacts us. So that's something that needs to also be discussed at that next level. So thank you for your time, Mr. Chair. Chief Fred Robbins, Eskedem.
Coach Jim Cookby, we'll hear from the delegates and have you respond all at once towards the end. Mic 5.
Coach Jim, Ryan Day, Cookby, Sukdaus, the Sukwebm. Thank you for your presentation and your work on the report, Chief Maureen. I don't really have a question on it. I guess I can give some context. So this year, nothing actually changed in terms of my community's readiness, so to speak, for fires to come on the other half of our reserve. So we're still about 65% exposed. The other 35% burnt last year. And how do I say this? So in a lot of stuff that we do with addressing our natural resource issues, we're always talking about cumulative effects. The other cumulative effect is the effect on our people. And so my community has really went through the ringer last year. As you know, the Elephant Hill Fire burned. I mean, when we saw a bit of the video. But the Bonaparte Indian Band almost solely relies on the Bonaparte watershed, and 2/5 of that watershed burnt to a crisp. And so we've been having a really rough time over the last year, and now we're dealing with landslides which have wiped out a couple of our homes, and people are still out living in hotels from just severe rainfall on August 11th, and now kind of living in fear every time it rains. And this is something that's going to continue on, and next year there'll be more mudslides, and there'll be, again, the fear of more fires and so on. And in the past 5 or 6 months, what I've also seen is my entire management team has left my band as well. And they're, you know, some of them were non-native, most of them were native, but not from Stoktaos. Their blood wasn't from that land, and so it makes it harder to stay and endure all of that, not just the emergencies themselves, but all of the effect on our people and how hard it was on our people and everything that comes out from that. You know, all of the fear and the hurt and the anxiety all comes out in different ways, and it taxes us. And so there's real cumulative effect on the people. And so although there were maybe some resources since last year, there could have been millions of dollars of resources thrown at my band, but we may not have been able to do anything with it because of capacity. So that's a real issue that I don't know how we crack that nut. But part of it is relieving the state of poverty that we live in. And the recommendation for having area-based tenures around our reserves, I think that's a great one, but they have to be big and all the way around our reserves so that we can start dealing with that in the way that we can. But, you know, it's a really multifaceted issue. I need homes so young people can move back to my reserve because 60% of them are over the age of 60 or more so than that. And so who's going to fight the fires? We're very fortunate we had a lot of experience, but my firefighters that saved my entire community last year, the average age was probably 60 years old. You know, so it's, you know, we're not going to be able to do that next year, or, you know, and then in 5 years or in 10 years, we need some young people that can be trained up. So I don't really have a question, just stating that we need to look at this over time, and the solutions need to take into account those realities, because the situation is dire, and we, you know, I've said it to every agency and every government, we are teetering on the edge, and it's really hard to attract people to work at my band when they know what we've been through and are still very exposed. So yeah, just stating that's where we're at, and I'm very, of course, very proud of my community and our strength, and we continue to endure. That's a word I've been using lately because a lot of agencies in health and housing and they're talking about resiliency. And I say resiliency is not a word I use. Resiliency is for when you have the economic means to adapt to something. We don't have that. We are enduring despite the circumstances, despite being economically marginalized. So, Cookstown.
Stem Cookby, being cognizant of the time, and we have a couple more presentations coming up that have resolutions attached to them. Mike 14.
Cookstown, Mr. Chairman. Henslan Squash Lease behind Cookby of Insuletco in the Gatlam Nation. I just wanted to talk about and comment on the unit crews in the Nicola Valley and how First Nations are being weeded out of those unit crews. When it was first established in the Nicola Valley, it was meant for the First Nations to be put to work. And now I look at the crews and there's not too many First Nations on there anymore. We have the unit crew bosses coming to talk to leadership saying, what's going on? We need our guys put back to work out there. I see in the report that it talks about how how we need to be involved. We know our backyards. We know the roads. That needs to be followed up with and followed through with. How many times has it been said before it's going to get done? Coldwater applied for application for 2 years in a row to do prescribed burns in the Nicola Valley within our traditional territory. 2 years in a row we were turned down by the province. So how can the province say that they want to work with First Nations when they deny us funding to do these prescribed burns in our backyards? There was a fire up in Juliet Creek area this year. And I went out there with the incident commander and I toured it. And even talking with the incident commander that there's a lack of communication within the bosses at Flinro. Because of all the alder that's overgrown up there in Coquihalla, and it's taken over where our huckleberry bushes are. And where the fire was, there was some steep terrain. So we told them, well, let it burn so we can get rid of the alder so the huckleberries can come back. Well, we have to talk to our bosses first. Too much politics in Flinro. They don't listen. So I wanted to comment on that because I read in your email for September 10th to the First Nations Leadership Council that there needs to be more engagement with First Nations. Well, when are you going to start listening to us? We've been trying to set up meetings with Minister Donaldson for the last 2 years. So I needed to comment on that. Cookstram.
Cookstram Cookby, appreciating we're really under the gun behind time. Quick response or addition for Mike 8 and Mike 15, then I'll be asking for the presenters to wrap up. I might have missed 6 earlier too. Mike 8?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I forgot to mention the RCMP piece. It's really interesting because First Nations policing, I didn't see them at all, other than the evacuation of my community. That's the only time I saw them. I was actually on a fire crew out fighting fire, and I was stuck out on the fire. I couldn't come home because I didn't have a pass to get through all of these blockades. And that was the frustrating thing for me, is I couldn't go home. And when I was able to go home, they were evacuating my community. They had 3 cop cars, buses, everybody had their vehicles all just packed to the gills. Everybody is driving up the road as I'm coming back from a fire. And that kind of relates back to the communication piece, you know, for our firefighters. Our firefighters that are out there, unlike my friend and colleague over here in Merritt, we have over 40 firefighters in our community. And when they're out in a fire and their community is being evacuated, they need to know. They don't want to have to come home to an empty reserve with maybe 20, 30, 60-year-olds protecting the reserve lands. So that communication gap needs to close. And with the RCMP and the discrimination that our firefighters had felt, you know, I brought this up with Butterworth Carr, and I actually sat down across from her and I told her about the discrimination that the firefighters had received from the fire. Our firefighters all geared up, hoses, pumps, everything in the back of their truck. We had 5-man unit crew back to the gills, all driving away from the fire back into Williams Lake to stay at a hotel at the IC's request. They get into Williams Lake, and then all of a sudden we have RCMP from Abbotsford and Burnaby pull them over. What do you got in the back of your truck? It's our fire gear. We just got off from a fire. Well, I'm going to have to inspect. They take everything out of the back of the truck, open the back doors, ask the firefighters to stand in a ditch while they unload everything out of the truck. Not finding anything, all right, thank you for your time. It's frustrating that I was a firefighter. I was doing 15-hour days, and I'm looking forward to the end of the day where I can actually get back, have a shower, put my feet up, and have something hot to eat. And then I end up spending another hour of my time reloading my truck with all my hoses, all my pumps, all of my gear, my Pulaskis, shovels, piss cans, because the RCMP threw them out and just left them on the side of the road. You know, it's frustrating that that happens. But on the lighter side, and hopefully I'm going to get some of you laughing here, but it just goes to show that when they bring in people, the RCMP from the coast, this explains a lot. I'll just tell the story first. An RCMP member was dispatched out to Big Creek. I want you to go to the first cattle guard you see, set up shop, don't let anybody in, anybody out. That road is now closed because of the fire situation. The RCMP is driving back and forth on Big Creek Road. Finally, they call back to the dispatcher. Well, I'm kind of curious, what is this guard wearing? So, this is a guy that grew up in Toronto, went to Regina, got educated in the RCMP, went from Regina to Burnaby, all in the cities. He comes out to Williams Lake to start setting up roadblocks, and he doesn't even know what a cattle guard is. You know, it's a funny situation, but if you really think about it, if there was an emergency and that RCMP member was told to go to that cattle guard, he doesn't know our territory. So we really need First Nations policing to start engaging in our First Nations communities and be part of the emergency response programs, rather than having Joe Blow from Regina or Toronto come in from another area and try to dictate to us where our territory boundaries are. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that.
Christian Cookby, Mike 15.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, CM to CA. Chief Don Toms, Heartland First Nation, just like to thank you for this opportunity and thank you for the detailed update. My community is not too far from Victoria. We're on the island, and for us on the island, we are beginning to have beginning to see fires in places that shouldn't be fires, and that they are burning longer than necessary, and it's pretty unnatural for. I like to believe that on Vancouver Island, I'm pretty well protected with that break of water, but I think this year and every year we begin to see more and more smoke, and we begin to see more and more. My mom, who suffers with severe rheumatoid arthritis, it also affects her lungs, and so the smoke was really affected us quite greatly on the island as well this year. But I just want to express my appreciation because I think we are finding ourselves at a time when I don't know where or what's going to happen in our province. And that's, to me, that's concerning. To me, that's dangerous because it's far too common to see forest fires now. Far too common for every summer that our sun is red. And so I think this work is important and will benefit us years down the road to be more prepared and to have, I think, some of this information earlier than later. So I thank Chief Chapman for your report. Just one quick additional note, Mr. Chair. I just wish to congratulate Union of BC Indian Chiefs on their 50th year. On behalf of Westjaclip, we are great and greatly appreciative of the amount of work that Union of BC Indian Chiefs has done in protecting our lands and protecting our rights, and I, for one, am appreciative of the work that we do here at HKCM.
HKCM, mic 24. Cookby.
Judy Wilson. I just wanted to introduce my father, Grand Chief Joe Manuel Sr. on mic 6. He had a comment he wanted to make.
Mic 6.
Good morning. I am from Nesconnath Reserve. Our reserve is split up in 3 different places. 2 are in the Chase area, 1 on the north side of the river, and number 2 is by the highway side on the south side of the river, and number 3 is way up in Salmon Arm. And one of our villages has timber adjacent to the village. So what we've done, we've cut down trees that were in danger of having fire too close to homes. So we cut all those trees down and branches and got rid of them, and all the burnable materials from all the 3 villages, but mostly from village on Nesconnath number 2. So I think prevention, you know, I really look forward to prevention of anything. You know, we don't have to wait for a fire to get alarmed. Fire is dangerous. So we should be more or less prepared for that kind of disaster, which took a lot of homes in Cass Creek area and other areas. So if you can provide the finance materials to do this kind of jobs, some places require more than we've experienced. You wait home, Kokcham.
Kokcham, Grand Chief. Turning to mic 22 or 23. 23 to begin concluding remarks and response, and give the Regional Chief a heads up. Immediately after these remarks, I'll invite you forward, Regional Chief. Mic 23.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And much of what you're saying here today, I heard throughout the process when I was out there on the land, visiting people. And I mentioned to Cameron yesterday, you know, that this report has been published for a while, and why wasn't I asked to come back to help to implement, or at least assist in the process of checking on these recommendations. And so we had that minor discussion. So I guess that would need to go to the Leadership Council or to the leaders here. If you're in support of that could be some work that could be followed on, because I can offer the context to your community meetings, your tribal meetings, whatever the case may be, because I agree we need to address everything that you've talked about. And embedded in here are a lot of those recommendations that you're talking about, Cookby Robbins and Cookby Day, Spahan, and Chief Don Tom. Definitely be interested in supporting you, and hope be able to remedy some of what you're talking about. And there's a lot of recommendations in the report about the physical and emotional and mental challenges and need for support and ongoing assistance, a collaboration with health, because it's not just one stream that is affected in our communities. So my last comment, in keeping with the spirit of a celebration, I want to say an early happy birthday to Grand Chief Joe Hall, who is in our room. It's his birthday tomorrow, so thank you very much.
Mic 22.
I know that we are pressed for time here, but the the themes that, you know, a number of you spoke to, the, you know, delays in approvals for prevention work that, you know, you're trying to do in your community, some of the communications problems, the, you know, the problems at roadblocks, you know, some of the underlying issues in terms of, you know, funding for capacity and, you know, the challenge that the communities have that is not, you know, specific to emergency management. You know, I think that, you know, Chief Chapman's, you know, recommendations reflect a lot of that. I don't know what the answers are, but, you know, hopefully as we work through some of these recommendations, we can get at some pieces of those. My contact information is there for, you know, people that want to follow up with some specific items. I did take notes, you know, as you were talking, but, you know, I hope that we can connect as well. Maybe I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. Heichgat, CM. In the layout, the rest of today, the Fisheries Council, Jordan has offered to come back and report out in February, so we'll kind of make up for him a little bit in February. Cliff Regan from New Relation Trust has a flight, so he's going to be up immediately after Regional Chief, who has a brief presentation, then on to the gaming negotiations, and then the financial audit. Regional Chief Mike, 22.
Thank you. Just before I leave, I just wanted to once again congratulate UBCIC for 50 years of advocacy. I just have a couple of comments about the forest fires up north. One of the biggest fires was the Shovel Lake fire. And it was good to see the Lilwat First Nation and Notlewutin unit crews work together. There's approximately 50 firefighters or First Nations working together. The fires this year, approximately 50% was dead mountain pine beetle trees that were on fire. Very high fuel load. The other thing that happened too in Chislata, Chief Karina Lewin was frustrated with the lack of communications with the RCMP and the province, so she started issuing her own permits for people coming into the area of her territory in Chislata. So I think, you know, First Nations, you know, just took it into their own hands, and there were many out there last year and this year that wanted to stay behind and protect the homes, and that was like Chilcotin and in the Burns Lake area. And matter of fact, I just talked to Chief Rick McLean from Taltanban, and their people won't be moving in back to their homes because some of those homes are burnt down, and some of those other homes that are still standing had smoke damage. So they challenged with moving back in would probably be by the end of November into December, but that's yet to be seen. So other things that happened this year, and we'll have at the BCAFN meeting, we'll have a session on the fires and ask those chiefs to present. So with that, I just want to congratulate UBCIC and for 50 years of advocacy on behalf of our First Nations. And yesterday, watching the film from 1969 and also the Constitutional Train, and knowing full well some of my relatives were there from Carrier-Secondary Territory, and looking at the roster, the names that were here 50 years ago, the late Chief Harry Pierre, former Carrier-Secondary Tribal Chief, and my chief, Mark French, who's still alive up in Takla, where we're here 50 years ago. And it's really good to see that there was representation from up north that came down here and you know, standing on the shoulders of big giants such as George Manuel. Wow. Those stories need to be told not only for our people, but in the general public. I mean, that's the history that needs to be told in schools. And it was really good to see that film by his daughter, and thank you. So without further ado, I just have a gift, and to the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, perhaps. President, you got lots of gifts yesterday. I'll give it to Judy. And don't forget to put it in your suitcase, your Indian suitcase. No, I'm just kidding.
Thank you for that, Regional Chief. Updated suitcase. Cliff has a flight to catch, so I'm going to invite him over to mic 22. He's got a deck to take us through. So Cliff Regan from the New Relation Trust. Mic 22.
Good morning, everyone. I believe you, my name is Cliff Regan. I'm the CEO of the New Relationship Trust. I believe you have a copy of the PowerPoint in your package as well. I'm going to go through the package, but there's one thing that my staff member, Rochelle Saddleman in the back, has put out around the table is a survey that we're doing. We do every 3 years a survey for NRT on what we're doing and where we're going, and to get some feedback from the leadership around the table. For those of you that fill that survey out today and submit it in, we're going to draw for $2,500 for your community, for your youth. So anybody puts in a survey for your community, we'll make a draw at the end of today and award $2,500 for your youth group or youth committee. Most of you know about the New Relationship Trust. We were established in 2006, and we were launched with $100 million in 2006. And basically what I want to do is give you a brief background, bring you up to date on what we're doing. And right now we're in the process of going out to 10 regions in the province. Next week we're in Nanaimo and Victoria, and then I believe the week after we're in Williams Lake and Kamloops, and then we end with Cranbrook, and we're already in the North Coast earlier this week. So since inception, we've allocated $81 million in the past 12 years for capacity development projects and administration. Of the $100 million. And the investment fund, at the end of August, was valued at $96.9 million. In addition to these regional engagements, we do an annual 5-year legislative review. There was one in 2011 and one in 2016, an independent review of the Act. Regional engagements basically provide the foundation for NRT to move forward, and we do it every 3 years. This is the year 2018 we're doing it. We need input from the leaders and community members to improve what we're doing. In the survey that you have on your table, as well as those surveys that occurred in the past, the 5 areas that we've funded: governance capacity, economic development, education, language, and youth and elders, were our 5 top priority items that came through every year that we have done this. In addition, the board, or not the board, the vast majority of leadership and respondents to the survey have recommended that we do a long-term investment strategy. Mission and vision, investing in First Nations in British Columbia to support their capacity building, and a British Columbia where we enjoy vibrant cultures, languages, effective and independent governments, social justice, economic prosperity, and all forms of education are valued and accessible. The vision basically accounts for those 5 funding areas that we do. Guiding principles, you've heard these before: supporting First Nation communities in capacity development, effective communications, fair and equitable access to services and funding, transparent criteria, increasing our investment fund is a priority, as well as not duplicating or replacing existing government fund, existing programs or First Nation programs. Annually, our board looks at a strategic plan. The one coming up in February 2019, we will be looking at a report that comes from the surveys. And so it's very important we get a response from all First Nations in the province on where you want us to go. One of the key goals of NRT is to keep our administration under 2% of our portfolio. This past year, we were 1.25%, or sorry, 1.15% in fiscal year 2018. The other thing that happened 3 years ago was leadership and First Nation members and stakeholders basically wanted us to move towards a perpetual fund. That is in the process now of looking at NRT as a perpetual fund. It was never set up that way, but we're moving in that direction based on the input of BC First Nations. In addition, NRT will spend $16.5 million over the next 3 years in our 5 funding areas. Investment portfolio, to give you an idea of where we are with our investment portfolio, 2015 we're at 91 million, 2016 at 86 million, 2017 at 96.4 million, and then at the end of this past fiscal year, we're at $92.6 million. The brackets, if you can see, you see those brackets, those are the interest rate returns that we've had in those years. On average, you'll see August 31st, 2018, the fund was at 96, or almost $97 million. On average, NRT, the average rate of return NRT has received is 6.91% per annum in the last 10 years of investing the fund. Expenditures, I commented that we expended $81 million since inception. 59.2 million were on those 5 areas of funding. 7.5 million were other initiatives that related to the federal government moving funding through NRT to First Nations in BC. 4.5 million on investment fees for the past 10 years and 10.9 million in administration for 12 years. NRT priorities for this fiscal year we're in now, 5.5 million. Governance capacity at $3 million, economic development at $875,000, education at $850,000, language at $200,000, and youth and elders at $500,000. Governance capacity, to give you a breakdown of what we fund. Governance capacity is for BC First Nations. All 203 are eligible to apply for grants under direct support for policy development. Tribal Council Policy Initiative is for First Nation councils or tribal councils to receive funding for policy development for their nation councils. That funding is still available, so if there's some tribal council, nation council out there that are looking for funding for policy development, you can contact our office. There's a new funding that we just announced a couple of months ago called Nation Governance, open to all BC First Nations that are looking at nation building or self-determination, going in that direction for research, practice of First Nation rights entitled to advance their authority and jurisdiction over lands, resources, citizens, and services. That funding is closed, but we are looking at approvals at this point in time. Resource Center website, we continue to put reports on there from First Nations on that website, fnbc.info. So sharing information is important. Economic development. One of the big things we do in economic development is support entrepreneurs and support communities in doing business. And we fund $5,000 for entrepreneurs and $25,000 for community-owned businesses. That money is, we partner with the Aboriginal financial institutions in the province, and they, for example, All Nations Trust here in this area, they work with entrepreneurs and community-owned businesses to get their businesses underway or expand. We also fund the foundation. We have a charitable foundation I'll talk about briefly. BC Aboriginal Business Awards on October 15th, we support that. And the Young Entrepreneur Symposium, we support that on an annual basis. Young Entrepreneur Symposium, November 26th to 29th in Edmonton. This is the only thing that NRT does that is national. And for those of you that have not heard of the YES Symposium, and there's 18 to 30-year-olds in your community that are interested in business or leadership or team building, they should be coming to this event. And honestly, if this is the best young Indigenous person conference in the country. So those who are interested in it, we have some sponsorship dollars to send people to Edmonton. Get a hold of our office. Check out yes2018.ca. And if First Nation communities want to sponsor young people from their community, we're very much open to that, and we're very much open to partnering with First Nation communities to send their young people to this event. It's life-changing, and we've had some amazing success in seeing young people move forward from this event. Education, scholarships and bursaries. NRT has done this the longest. $600,000 that we put into scholarships and bursaries for First Nation students in BC this year. And over the past 11 years that we've done this, $7.6 million has been awarded from NRT to scholarships for students from British Columbia. And it doesn't matter where you go to school, as long as you're from BC, you're eligible to apply. K-12 funding, $5,000 grants for First Nation schools and or First Nation communities, education committees, education departments. There's money left. This program just started for the school year. If you have initiatives, please submit an application to us for $5,000 grants. NRT Foundation, I'm not sure if everyone's aware, we do have a charitable foundation, and we put all our scholarships and bursary activity through that foundation now in order to leverage it, to leverage those dollars through private and other public funding sources for First Nation communities. To give you an idea, this year we funded $600,000 from NRT itself. This year we approved $1.6 million in scholarships and bursaries with our partners. Our NRT Foundation goal is to establish a $30 million endowment fund, which would fund scholarships and bursaries forever in the province of $1 million a year. That's our goal. And to date, the foundation and NRT and our partners have supported over 2,000 students in the amount of $10.6 million. Youth and elders, we have youth and elder group funding, $2,000 for youth groups and $2,500 for elder groups. Those are the budgets there. We still have money for for youth groups. All the elder money has been taken. The elder groups are on it. They know what they're doing. Language funding this year, we've changed for this fiscal year to add an additional $200,000 for youth groups that want to undertake language revitalization within their communities, be it a language camp, an immersion camp, an event with elders. They can access up to $4,000 for language. Special projects, these all end this fiscal year. We have done these projects in partnership with the federal government. You'll know that we only fund, we've got all our money from the province, and so the federal government has come on for us to disperse funding into First Nations. So Community Labor Market and Navigators have been working with First Nations in the north on building capacity around skills training, and we're trying to expand this to the whole province next fiscal year and have these navigators work in the economic development field with First Nations. We have another initiative called Economic Development Support Team, and this is Indigenous business specialists that we have. working with us to support BC First Nations taking next steps for complex business projects and or building capacity in your economic development field within your community. We have 11 advisors that are Indigenous, Aboriginal from BC that work with BC First Nations. We've been working with 40 of them, and we're trying to extend this project again this coming fiscal year. If any First Nation communities want some support in economic development, they should be contacting our office as well. Clean Energy Initiative, I'm sure most of you are aware of this, a partnership we have with Western Diversification. We've allocated $1.2 million this year for this. The demand is very high for clean energy projects in our communities. We're trying to extend this program with WD for 5 years, and we should know in January, February of this year, and we'll announce in the new year. West Coast Energy was a one-time fund of $4.5 million, and it was originally a loan fund, and INAC or DISC and ourselves changed it to a contribution fund because all the money would have went back to Canada. We approved $4.5 million about a month ago for First Nations to build capacity around energy in their communities. Funding map, transparency, accountability. On our website, transparency, accountability is important to us. You can click on your nation or other nations and find out how much funds NRT has given to that community. It also includes scholarships and bursaries. Our annual audit, just to remind you that we have annual reports here. If anybody wants to see an annual report, they're also online on our website, and we post that by August 1st based on our legislation of every year. And you can actually go back and see every annual report online. My last slide really is something that has already been performed by the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and that is the reappointment of Chief Byron Lewis. This year, their appointments are from BCFN, First Nations Summit, and UBCIC. You see our board of directors there. NRT as an organization does not appoint directors ourselves. All the appointments come from the Leadership Council groups and or the province of BC. Our website is newrelationshiptrust.ca, and I tried to be fast. Again, I want to remind you, please get your surveys in. Rochelle in the back will make a draw after lunch. She's on the left. And also, we have the survey online, and we're giving away iPads for people that fill out the survey online. And we will be continuing our regional engagements over the next 3 weeks. So thank you for your time. If you have any questions, open to questions for sure. Hawa.
I'm afraid we don't have time for questions at this point, Cliff. We're behind schedule and you've got a flight to catch, so we'll take your presentation for information. I'm sure everybody here has got your contact info so they can follow up with you directly. So with that, Hawa, Cliff. I just want to do a quick check-in. We've got 3 more presentations that have resolutions attached to them. Is there anybody leaving before we're done those 3 presentations? One or 2 is manageable. Any more than that is problematic. To give you a quick heads up, is Wamish in the room? Back in the far right there. Wamish is going to circulate the Moose Hide campaign, some information on it. I'm not going to speak to it necessarily, but just hand out some information regarding it. With that, I'll invite forward Huiyu, Elder George Saddleman, for an Elders Abuse Project update. And I'd ask you to open your resolution kit to that resolution. You can stay along with George as he's presenting. And just before turning it over to George, if you know George, his hearing struggles at times. So I'd ask everyone here, and I'm speaking to everyone in the room, if you're having a conversation, a side conversation, take it outside, please. Everyone. Because otherwise George is going to have a really hard time hearing you. As well, if you're speaking, speak closely into the microphone, please, and thank you. Mic 23.
I'd like to acknowledge the good and hard work and steady work. Chair Tyrone, very tough job here when you're trying to lead a young and old team down the hillside, coming and going. Thank you, Tyrone. I'd like to acknowledge the person that said the opening prayer this morning. Much appreciated. Also like to acknowledge the Secwepemc leadership for hosting this very historic meeting. I think back in November of '69, I guess that's when I probably began my role in the political world. I was in Caribou College at the time, taking first-year business administration. And I never looked back since. Glad to see the leadership that are here, especially the elders, trying to get their 2 cents in from the traditional point of view. I see the youth here as well. I guess probably when we look at the road that we traveled, a lot of process for the last 50 years. Over the years, in the last while, I've been trying to pronounce the whole importance of our respective language. Our oral stories, certainly songs, and ceremonies, as we've seen last night. Those are very important pillars of our culture. I see we try to incorporate them in the institutions such as we're sitting in now, just to remind us of who we are. In Teal'c's culture, at least, I see 4 different perspectives: Chief Salmon, Chief Black Bear, Chief Bitterroot, Chief Shia. They have a perspective that was expressed from Kisepi times. When our people had meetings, people like Tyrone would facilitate the meeting, knew everybody's Indian name places, et cetera, and we'd meet for a day, 2 days, 3 days, a week. All those 4 chiefs had an opportunity to express themselves. There wasn't a mover and a seconder to do any kind of work that way. It was all done by consensus. And I guess over the years, since got into the institutional process, we find the Roberts Rules of Order has split our people, our leadership anyway, because those 4 and those against, and then we all of a sudden got enemies amongst ourselves. We don't associate with that chief anymore or that community, blah, blah, blah. So the sooner we get back to our traditional governance structure, the better. I remember in 1995, I think that was a year, at KXA, BC leadership meeting. At the end of the day, we all agreed that we'll go home and rebuild our nations. And we're still on that process. So it's a tough road. Capacity and resources that we get are very restrictive. We can't do the things from a traditional point of view. I'm glad there are traditional families out there that still carry on those traditional values. either collectively within their families or by themselves, moving things forward, keeping it alive. One of the big things I've read, I'm a student of constitutional law. Courts basically look at written history. Only recently they have taken on the memory process that we have, because we pass our information from generation to generation to generation. So that's why I'm glad to hear elders speak at the different meetings, expressing the things about the responsibility of their knowledge that they've carried and still carry forward, so that leadership of the day can listen, understand, at least grasp some of the strength that is required to move us forward. I'm also a student of protocol. I've been given that challenge now for about 8 years, trying to come up with some understanding with leaders on an intertribal basis about the protocols from Giuseppe times. If we know the language, stories, songs, and ceremonies, we can pull things together. We have to stay alive as a people. So those are the things I'm advocating. I don't stand in front of a camera, but I'm in the background doing. I have a little library at home, one shelf dealing with law, another one dealing with history, another one dealing with a lot of reports that come forward from the UBCIC, First Nations Leadership Council, all those places. So if somebody asks me a question, in my own filing system, I know where it is. But one of the big values that we have is oral interpretation, oral stories. In these days, we find ourselves arguing amongst ourselves. That's not the way we do it. That's not the way we do it. Well, we all have different perspectives. But what we're talking about is still the same. The timich is still the same. So we have to respect those perspectives to move us forward. Which brings me back to the responsibility I have here at the Chiefs Executive Council level. I was appointed or selected as representative for the elders at the table. It's been a tough road to hoe because of the fact that capacity and resources for such work is far and few between. The work that we're looking at probably doesn't fit the criteria of some of the program and services that are offered by federal funding agencies or provincial funding agencies. So last time I was here at CEC meeting, June, I think it was, a couple of leaders asked me, well, what is it you want, George? You seem to be saying the same thing every time we come to the meeting. Show us something. So I said, okay. With zero capacity and resources, I leaned on the executive office saying, I need a policy analyst or a writer to do something. So I've been assigned to a couple of wonderful policy analysis and writers, put together a resolution that is on the table today. The resolution speaks in principal terms about the kind of things that we envision. At least listening to the floor, listening to community members, listening to elders. I think the resolution captures at least the principles of what we're trying to do. I do have a committee, and right now I just forgot who the committee members are. We haven't met since January, so. But as you review the resolution, I was part of the writer, giving my expression to the policy writers, and they did a fairly good job of getting a message onto the resolution. So hopefully with your support today that we can bring back to the next Chief Executive Council meeting later this year or January with some concrete work. There is a lot of Aboriginal institutions in British Columbia, all with a different mandate. Mandates that are different. So my main concept is to bring those mandates to the floor, some meeting floor, not this one, but a meeting floor, to come up with some strategic thinking about how we deal with elders' abuse. How do we deal with it? It's a big problem. And it's been expressed from time to time. I know I've experienced some of those abuses with elders that I know. The legislation, the provincial legislation, very strong dealing with this. A lady was hurt in a car accident, got a large sum of money of settlement. The family wanted to make sure that she had a comfortable living. She came to me once upon a day and said, "George, what am I going to do with all this money?" I said, "You can't live at home. Why don't you buy a house in town where you can get close services, et cetera, et cetera?" Well, the social services in town system scooped this lady up, applied their own power of attorney, and put her into a rental place where they paid her rent and all that sort of stuff. They bleeded her basically out of her compensation. I think she just had enough money to pay for her funeral expenses when she passed on. So those are the kind of things that are real. In a sense, because of the fact that we have an economic constitution, any kind of money that's floating around, somebody has to make money, and the province saw this and paid her rent at this place, etc., until they exhausted her. So those are just one of the horror stories that I could think of. So rather than take up any more time, Tyrone, I'll let you carry on with the resolution. Why? Limnum
Huiyu. So with that, we will go to the resolution. I know the Grand Chief wants to speak in a bit, but we'll go to the resolution first. I'll draw your attention to Resolution 2018-41 regarding support for community-based elder outreach programs. Therefore, we resolve the UBCIC Chiefs in Assembly direct the UBCIC Executive to assert to both the federal and provincial governments the urgent need to fully fund and implement community-based elder outreach programs in order to identify and prevent instances of elder abuse. And therefore, finally, we resolve the UBCIC Chiefs in Assembly direct the UBCIC Executive to support the UBCIC Elders Representative in reaching out to like-minded organizations to find a host for the creation of a workshop materials, outreach strategies, and other implementation efforts for community-based elder outreach programs. Looking for a mover. Mike 8.
Chief Fred Robbins, get him.
Kushdem Cookby, seconder. Mike 14.
Chief Lease Behan, Co-Water Band.
Kushdem Cookby, opening up the discussion, starting at Mike 6, the Grand Chief. You've already been introduced, so we'll go directly to you. Mike 6.
Cookcham. My name is Grand Chief Joe Manuel Sr. of the Niskanas First Nation and a member of Shuswap Tribe and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. First of all, I want to congratulate George Salomon on his interest of looking after us old people. Right now, I'm very well looked after by my wife and the Creator. And I want to thank everyone here for allowing me to speak. Mr. Chairman, delegates, and honored guests. The missing and murdered women is of a great concern to me. I know too many other parents have lost loved ones. I know exactly how they feel because it happened to me. I lost one of my daughters, murdered by a drug addict, nearby here in Salmon Arm. There are many murders of Aboriginal women right here in BC, such as Salmon Arm, Kamloops, Highway of Tears, Prince George. I believe the majority of murdered women were in Manitoba. I would like to express my condolence to all the families who lost their loved ones, part of their family of all ages. I believe that Mr. Prime Minister Trudeau is not trying, neither is the RCMP, to resolve this matter. I heard that the RCMP back east say that it was a missing and murdered women's common law husband or boyfriend that were responsible. If the RCMP knew that as a fact, why wasn't there an arrest? The RCMP have mistreated some of the First Nations people, especially in Saskatchewan, where the freezing winter time, they have taken First Nations men miles out of town. They were to walk back with no shoes. They froze to death. Only one barely made it out alive, out of all the men to tell what happened. Were the RCMP disciplined? I asked the public. And I believe with all my heart that's murder, an attempted murder. I believe that some of the police may be responsible and involved in some of the missing and murdered women. They too should be investigated by professional investigators. There is a recent report made in the province of Manitoba, the RCMP with mental problems. How many more out there is there with a similar illness? I believe we should change up the police force to get something done. In the news, a policeman was found by DNA that he raped and murdered many women in California, USA. They called him the Golden State Killer. His name is Joseph D. Angelo. He eluded capture for 4 decades. He did 12 murders and 50 rapes. There was also a former policeman right here in Kamloops by the name of Alan Davidson, who has been sentenced to 6 years only for sexually assaulting boys. The 62-year-old was convicted of 5 charges in BC dating back more than 35 years and pleaded guilty to 2 more charges stemming from incidents in Saskatchewan, where he was working as an RCMP constable in the 80s and 90s. There are people you are supposed to trust. Example, residential school priests, that's supposed to be trustworthy people, molested a lot of children, boys and girls. Do some of the police too. The police are supposed to be trustworthy people, and the police are to serve and protect. I believe that racism is still strong in our country for these heinous crimes to continue. There has been over 1,000 women murdered and counting. We cannot stand by and allow this to continue. The ones that are found guilty should be charged with hate crimes. On top of the murder charge, I recommend that criminals, once time served in jail, to be deported out of our country. We don't need people like this amongst us. I waited for the longest time for the law to begin investigating. Now I strongly believe we need action. The Missing and Murdered Women Inquiry received $50 million, and the money, I believe, would be better spent for investigating the missing and murdered crimes. It's time for action, to hire an army, a team of professional detectives, investigators in each province until this is all cleared up. I believe strongly that there is discrimination in public in general and in the police force, and that they're investigating murder and missing and murdered women, as they should be. We should create a special task of police to investigate. I believe it should not be advisable for RCMP to investigate their own. We should ask anyone, a group, example, Mr. John Wallace, you see on TV a lot, he finds criminals. Scotland Yard, they're supposed to be one of the top investigators, but we can't trust our own security. I request the BC Union Chiefs to write a letter to Prime Minister Trudeau and or rewrite the letter in better words to mean the same. A copy should go to the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry, and the provincial minister, John Horgan, he's been standing by us through thick and thin and the pipeline and all. He's a person who can't be pushed around. In support of an army of professional investigators to take action that has long been overdue. Seems that everyone in Canada has human rights, but our First Nations. And we want Prime Minister Trudeau to declare to the public in Canada that we also have human rights, and to remember it. I believe the Minister, Justin Trudeau, had gone to another country. I believe he was in Syria. I saw on TV news, heard him loud and clear, where he said that all Syrians have human rights. What about our human rights in our beautiful country? We need to challenge the federal government to acknowledge that we have human rights, to announce it publicly. I don't believe there is anything in the world that is impossible. And when there is a will, there's a way. I want to see our First Nations work compatibly with the rest of the people in Canada and eliminate and we be treated with respect in our beautiful country. I support, too, the resolution of the women's. And also, I want to congratulate the staff and the President for 50 years of good work for all of our First Nations in UBCIC.
Cooks Jim, Grand Chief, is it okay if we take your notes? A lot of what you're raising are issues around policing, missing and murdered women, girls, residential schools, racism, those things. We have a number of resolutions that address them already, but if we could have your notes, we could just make sure that if you're bringing something new, it could be factored in somewhere. And being mindful, we do have a resolution on the floor. And as I mentioned this morning, the union's rules is that you have somebody with a lanyard introduce you if you don't have a lanyard. Any other discussion? Mike 7.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maureen Chapman, Chief of Squelch. I would just like to add, based on the story that we just heard from George, that the UBCIC executive follow-up regarding recourse for these sorts of instances that have occurred. And we know there's a long list of abuses that people have reported to us. They've got to know that there's going to be recourse after the fact. Thank you.
Go to mic 24 to introduce the next speaker.
Chief Judy Wilson introducing Elder Bert Denault for the Secwepemc Elders Council.
Thank you. Mic 9.
Cook Jam, right up. I'm going to talk about the motion. I've been sitting here for the last few days, and I spoke the other day, but I have a funny feeling with when we talk about taking stuff back to the community, or talking about First Nations, or talking about our governance we talk about. And everything it comes back to the point that the government of Canada puts us bands in the position of that we're there the governing authority of our people. And that is totally wrong. Because we talk about elders. The elders, I know, have been abused many times over the course of since I've been at the elders table for about 20 years in Secwepemc Nation. And over the fact that we talk about I got to do this, I'm sorry, but I'll talk about the fires. The fires are caused by the federal government of Canada and the forestry. Because in the back of the day, as a young council at 22 years old, when the pine beetle arrived, we were at these meetings like this with the federal government, and the elders told them we have to burn that thing. Burn it to control that beast. We told them that country will burn down way back 20, 30 years, 40 years ago when this thing occurred. So I blame Canada, and that it's their responsibility, and they didn't listen because the biologists said that the bugs were dormant in the wintertime, and then they can haul those logs to the mills. And that was the same time, if everybody, some of the elders know, that there was the NAFTA, or the World Trade Organization, Art Manual worked on. At the same time, they were trying to move that allowable cut business. And here we're still talking about allowable cuts, and we can't even go cut any timber. We went to court many years ago. It's still in court, Harper Lake. I never heard anything about it. We went logging, and then nothing happened. We went to court, and why did we quit logging? Why did we quit getting our own resources off our land? Now the UN Declaration has many things to say about it. But we have to put perspective to our leadership and our leadership councils, whoever is leading, because Secwepemc has a leadership. And that's got to come from the elders' table. I have tried and tried to the elders' table to take the initiative and say, the elders, let's pass a motion that we take the powers away from the chief and councils within the Secwepemc Uluk. But that hasn't been done. And why? Because we don't have money as elders. We have to go to the tribal council, and we get travel expense. I've been at that elders' table, and I've always got just travel expense for gas. And another thing that burns me, we talk about all our past leaders, and you look at that picture back there and take it on a perspective of where we live today. Those people there, we heard stories. They came to this meeting broke and destitute, to fight for land title and rights. And here we are today still talking about the same thing, and we're all flush. We're all got money from Canada. We all are rich in increase of goods. In fact, let me tell you a story. I heard stories for elections coming up in through the bands. I talked to people that get for election. Oh, why are you going to go for election? Because I got to pay my mortgage. I got to pay my mortgage. I got bills to pay. What about the people and the generations of our children and great-grandchildren coming up? How are they going to pay their bills? It's all about economics. We talk about economics. I remember as a young council, I went to and I tried to tell a tribal level when the Economic Development Fund came down initially. But the people, all with, because we're separate, all the bands are all separate and autonomous according to the way we live today. And we talk about collective, we talk about our rights, but we're all being treated as individual entities within Shuwapmakuluga of 17 nations instead of one nation. The programs and services coming down must reflect the national responsibility to our people and not the nation of the First Nations of KIB or Nisconlith or even Khilaut, because that's where I'm from. It's not on the map yet. Oh, it is on the map, pardon me. But we have to be looking at a way we operate. We're operating as 17 nations, and I'm sure every nation here, you say, oh, I'm First Nations, I'm the Nisconlith Indian Band or Adams Lake, whatever. You're not. We're people, but we have to change that. Okay, I'll cut right there. Just one more point. But all along, we have to develop is the UN Declaration, and in accordance with our governance structure must look at nation to nation, not band to nation. Thank you.
Thank you. Being mindful, we have a resolution on the table. Do we have any other discussion? Question's been called. Any opposition to the resolution? Any abstentions to the resolution? Seeing neither, it is carried. Thank you. We're good? Mike 23.
Just like to thank the floor for taking a moment to review the resolution. Thank you very much, and I'll carry on with the work. Bye, Limnam.
Limnam Huyu. So quick check-in with you. It's 12:18. We can either storm on with the agenda or we can take a really short break for lunch, maybe even dishing up and continuing with the meeting. Are there any preferences? Pardon me? Let's take a short break, maybe 30 minutes, depending how long it takes you to dish up, and then we'll start the meeting again while you're eating with the next presentation.
We got two more issues, right? Like 5 food prayer.
Yes, and as just reminded, somebody from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls has a prayer at mic 5.
La is te huino. Mis tessis luch mactua, te calmuch, squaxed, Colleen Seymour, my shamat name, te kamlups te shwepmuch. Cookstja cook te kel cook pi, cookstja cook ke as, el kapa as. Cookstja cook met te shwepmuch, cookstja cook te na elia shwepmsteen. Cookstja cook te na elia shwepm uluch. Cookstja cook pien, hohwaait na elia su acht. Kunuchwanta cook, hohwaait te stem pien na elia su acht cook. As las comtuses, sta ax koech hohwaait te sied. Jachminta koech hohwaait te kos eltens koech, el hohwaait te sta memmels koech, hohwaait te eems koech, el wet na sta ekja. Jachminta salchwas koech, Yi salchwa, yi kachtels da swomacht. Koekstja koekt, mietjes koek, te excess, de swen Quamtusis. Cookstech cook te matichias cook te soups cook Quamtusis. Welchmiaus, welchmiaus, welchmiaus. I say, it is good you made it through the night. We thank you, Creator. We thank you, grannies and grandpas. We are called a Shawhepan. Today, we thank you for this Shawhepan language and thinking of all the other languages out there. Today, we thank you for our territory that we're on, Shawhepan Uluch. We thank you for everything that is here and now. Help us with everything here and now. May we always go along in a good way every day. Take care of all our family, all of our children, all of our grandchildren, and those yet to be born. Take care of our water. The water gives us our life. We thank you for the blood that runs through our body. We thank you for our breath of life forever, forever, forever. And those missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls, men and boys, and for our water.
Cook's Gems, look after your elders first, please. Look after your elders. Mic 5. Mic 5. It's coming on. Try.
Again, thank you. As our executive secretary was going around interrupting the meeting, but it's for a good cause. She's going around taking your business card. Gina's sitting over to my right. If you don't have your business card, we're going to do some raffles during lunch hour here, and this is a small token on behalf of TTS's different departments who've donated. Again, this is a small gesture of our token and our hospitality at Kamloops. So get your business cards into Gina. We'll be back on the mic in 15 minutes to do all these draws. Thank you once again.